Dele Alli was once one of England's most promising footballers, winning the PFA Young Player of the Year awards in both 2016 and 2017. More recently, his game has suffered though. And in a moving interview with Gary Neville, he has explained why. Dele Alli told Neville about his incredibly tough childhood, including him being sexually abused aged 6 and dealing drugs aged 8. He also explained how in his later life he's struggled with his mental health, an addiction to sleeping pills, and how he's recently come out of rehab. Here's Dele Alli explaining why he is going public with his personal story now.
I got out 3 weeks ago, I think.
That recent?
3 weeks ago, yeah. And if I'm being honest, I probably wouldn't have wanted to talk about it this soon. I think maybe give it a little bit more time. But I am feeling in a really good place and I feel strong enough to do this. I think it's important. Maybe could have done with a little bit more time in terms of when I was talking about it. But unfortunately, the way the world is now, the tabloids, they found out and they was calling my team a lot and they were telling, that they knew where I was and stuff. And the decision that I maybe made in the past when I didn't really care about what people thought and I didn't care about being understood, I would have just let them write what they wanted to write and, put their own story on, which they do a lot of the time, but it's not the reality. And also, I want to help other people to know that they're not alone in the feelings they've got and that you can talk to people. It doesn't make you weak to get help, to be vulnerable. There's a lot of strength in that. So to come out and to share my story, I'm happy to do it.
The full 45-minute interview is on the Overlap YouTube channel. The clip we've just shown you has gone viral on social media. Dele Alli is getting an enormous amount of support. At the same time, it doesn't seem like the tabloid press has been so understanding.
Dele Alli was my phone wallpaper for a really long time. It was the photo of him scoring a goal and then celebrating in front of just like a wall of furious Chelsea supporters. And I think that Dele Alli, when he was at Tottenham, he was just a sublime player in so many ways, and we really, really did love him. But the flip side of the intensity of that love in football is that players are under such intense scrutiny and judgment. And if they exhibit any of the human frailties that all of us have, either in terms of performance or attitude, or they're struggling in some way, they are suddenly placed in one of the most psychologically battering situations possible, because you've got all of this hate on social media. You've got just an awful amount of noise and criticism and vitriol coming at you from the terraces. And then you add onto that the behavior of the tabloid press. I'm surprised that anyone is able to put themselves through it, let alone someone who's gone through as much as Dele Alli clearly has. I mean, the details of that interview, I think, were genuinely shocking. On the one hand, Dele Alli, he seemed like someone that we already knew so much about. He lived his life in a fishbowl because he was a professional footballer. Cameras just on him all the time. And yet there was this depth of suffering, the abuse and the exploitation that he experienced at a very young age, the circumstances of the breakdown of his relationship with his parents. You suddenly realize that what you think you know from seeing someone in that fishbowl, so much of it is an illusion. You might have a critique of the media and you might think, oh, I'm really switched on. But for me, it challenged a lot of my preconceptions. I genuinely found myself questioning some of my own judgments and my own relationship to the media through watching this interview. And aside from the stuff which was about his personal experiences, his childhood, I think one of the most heartbreaking things was that he's effectively been forced into telling his story much earlier than he would have wanted to because of tabloid press intrusion. That when they knew that he was in rehab for a substance abuse problem, they were calling up his team to be like, we know where he is. And that is kind of taunting. It's like applying a form of psychological torture to someone who you already know is in this really vulnerable position because you can, because you want to get the story, because you want to get all of the salacious details. And I think that this week of all weeks, when we've seen the way in which the Hugh Edwards story has played out. As journalists, you've got to recognize that turning over somebody's life is a very, very serious thing. And I'm not saying that it means that you have to pull all of your punches and not be critical, not ask really difficult questions because of people's mental health. There's a balance to be struck there. But hounding someone when you know that they're in recovery, you know that they're in recovery for a substance abuse problem, what do you want from that other than to destroy them psychologically and emotionally so you can film the wreckage and film the ruin? I mean, that's a story that has played out for so many people in the public eye, particularly people who've come from working class backgrounds, particularly people for whom fame and money happened really quickly. And again, there's this feeling that we know everything about them, but there's real pain and real trauma in their past. I believe in press freedom. Of course, I believe in press freedom. I believe in the right of the press to hold the rich and the powerful accountable. But I feel deeply uncomfortable and disgusted by the fact that destroying people's lives is itself a commodity, that tabloids and paparazzi and journalists deliberately set out to destroy someone's mental well-being because that creates more of a story which enables them to sell papers, generate clicks, drive ad revenue. That's something which I think should make us all feel really, I think, uncomfortable with some of the aspects of the profession that we operate in.
That was very much the narrative of the Britney documentary that the New York Times put out, which was that essentially, sort of the paparazzi were essentially sort of or driving her to her wit's end and then taking pictures of that and then selling the story that they in a way had created. Is there also something positive we can take away from that interview, which is that football, I mean, you could say surprisingly, but maybe not surprisingly, football has become an area of culture which seems to be having quite a positive influence on the rest of society, be it racism, be it openness about mental health. It seems to be a source of, is it okay to say a source of reason, a source of reasonableness is coming from Premier League football? What do you think?
Football, truly a land of contrasts. I mean, the answer to that is yes and no. Football is still dogged by many of the problems that has been associated with it, since the 70s and 80s, right? There's a really toxic edge of masculinity. And also what we're seeing through many of these discussions about men's mental health, I'm thinking here not just about Dele Alli, but Danny Rose, another former Spurs player who's spoken very openly about his struggles with depression. You go, well, this is not just a reflection of culture changing more broadly around a degree of openness and candor around men's mental health, but is able to also shape and drive forward that cultural change. And I really like to see that happen. I mean, something which I've felt for a really long time is that this generation of footballers, whether that's, Bukayo Saka or Tyrone Mings or Dele Alli, it's so different from some of the nastiness that dominated the so-called golden generation of the early 2000s. And I'm pleased to see that cultural change. And I think that one thing that this interview can do is that it can shine a light beyond the realm of football as well. The things that Dele Alli is talking about, the experiences of abuse, being economically exploited, dealing drugs as a child, that is a set of circumstances which affects many young people in this country. People who have experienced really challenging family circumstances, people who find themselves in situations of impoverishment and exploitation, and then get sucked into the criminal justice system. Now, that aspect wasn't part of Dele Alli's story. He had a skill that we value and we reward as a society, which is being just a preternaturally amazing footballer. But that human story of suffering, of struggling with it, of being vulnerable, being exploited by others, and being pulled into something where if you get caught, your life can be ruined forever because you get a criminal record, because you're incarcerated, because you're sucked into that criminal justice system. Dele Alli's position as a footballer allows us to recognize his full humanity. So dealing drugs doesn't become the heart of the story. Actually, it's his trauma and his human experience, which is the center of that story. That is also the case for people that aren't footballers, for people who just, aren't really incredible at, you know, depossessing the opponent and scoring an excellent goal. And I think that telling those stories about people who are economically exploited is also a really positive thing.